are four big thrusts within this talk, and the first one is actually talk about licensing. I know a question came in to maybe talk about licensing on the panel. What I'll say is that this is not meant to be the end of the licensing story. Licensing is sort of big and complex and interesting. I'm not quite sure if it's interesting, but there's a lot of things to consider. There's also sometimes you can just say, I'm going to use this and put it on my code. But it should come back up with the panel. And so I encourage, if you have questions, I might just make up a question if nobody asks, to sort of get people's feeling about licensing. But then there's aspects, right, of developing a code, any flavor of code, whether it's open, whether it's a community code, whether it's a free code, right, that you just want people to download and do something with, about how you cultivate that, how you actually make it easy for people to do that. And these are sort of some best practices that, through a variety of open source projects, people have really identified. The first thing I think that's really important for everybody to know is that even if you don't have a license on your code, you basically have copyright on it. So my one question is sort of the instant poll category, right? But I'm curious if how many people know the license that's on the code that they're using right now, assuming you didn't know that it automatically had copyright. How many people know? OK. How many people think it matters what you can do with your code, what kind of license it has on it? OK. And the other relevant question, and I'll collect these, it won't just be a random straw poll, and you'll be like, OK, and I move on, is how many people are writing their own code versus like using a community code? So how many are writing their own code? OK, wonderful. So the reason I ask that is what code you have does have an impact on what relationship you have with anybody else who uses your code. And that's not necessarily just a science collaborator. That could even be a vendor, right? Like you go to Intel and you say, hey, Intel, help me make my code faster. And they will care what license you have on it. And I'll get into that in a minute. So understand that it's not unique. It's not just unique to you. Yes?
If you're going to address this later, please tell me. But I have always wondered the distinct differences between copyright and license. And how are those different, and what implications does that have to you?
It's a great question. So the question was, what are the actual differences between copyright and license? I hesitate to give a complete answer, and what we might do is actually talk through that in a little bit in the panel. There are some things that I will outline here. And the reason I hesitate a little bit is in part is just this anxiety I have that sometimes when I answer the question, whether it's right or not with licensing, has an issue, right? Like, I don't want to tell you something wrong about licensing or copyright. That's the simplest way to describe it. But fundamentally, one thing about the copyright, right? One thing to understand about the copyright is that you own it, right? If your code is copyrighted, that means that is your code. That if somebody else wants to use it, you can still give it to them, right? But nobody else technically has the right just to go take that code and do whatever they want to do with it and not credit you. And the crediting is where the licensing comes in, right? Like, so the licensing really has to do with how you give credit back. This is what I know, right? And beyond that, just let me know that the deeper conversation can be had later. One thing to note, right? If you don't want to put a license on your code, you don't want to worry about it, you don't want to think about it, you don't want to do anything, it's at least worthwhile to put copyright you in a year, right, within the code, so that you know when you sort of stamp it. It automatically has it, but it's something that is occasionally looked at, right? Well, did it say copyright? It didn't say copyright, right? You just do it, and then you're OK. But the license is the social contract, as I said. It's sort of the thing that says, if you're going to use my code, what do you need to do to use it, right? How do you give me credit? How do you interact with me? And I think this is really crucial when it gets into concepts of intellectual property, when it gets into concepts of collaboration and credit, right? And not credit like ego-boosting credit, but making sure that you get the credit you need for your career, right? One of the things that I think is fascinating, that I didn't know this statistic. This is Nathan's. These are Nathan's slides, right? I just keep repeating that so you know that Nathan gets credit for this. Is the incredibly small fraction of codes on GitHub, for example, that have any sort of license attached to them. And what I will describe is that licensing is not hard. Licensing is taking a file and putting it in your code for the most part. And it's a really small number. And when you consider that this is a tool that's really meant to share, right? It is designed so that you can share your source code with people. It's a little surprising, as I said, since that license is that relationship, that contract between you and who might use your code. Yeah?
So the codes that are available at GitHub and doesn't have any license, it strictly mean that we cannot use it without acknowledgement of the author?
That's a great question. The question was, if a code is on GitHub without a license, can you use it without acknowledging the author, permission from the author? I will give you my opinion about that, okay? My suspicion is, my gut would be that I would want to go talk to the developer of that code before I used it for anything, just to make sure, right? Because if I got invested in it and I was excited by it and there was no copyright, there was no copyright stated, there was no anything, no sort of license stated, and then I figured something out that I could do that was interesting, and I went back to them and they went, no, don't. They have the right to do that. So from my perspective, from my time, I would not want to. Okay. All right. The first thing is that these slides should be up. If they're not, they're going to be up really soon. It's really, really easy to create a license. It's very easy. A license is basically a text file, and you can do this in a few different ways in your code. But these are just links, sort of examples of what codes have done to put a license, right? Sometimes in the top directory on GitHub, there's just license.txt. Some people have a directory that gives some information, but it's really straightforward. And I'll also talk a little bit about the different licenses. But there are some things I will say not to do when you're doing a license. First, don't write your own. Unless you have help from your institution writing your own distinct license, don't do it. Now, there are reasons sometimes where you don't just want to take an open source license and put it on your code. There are real reasons, right? Your institution might have a problem with you doing that. Most universities and open research institutions have really come around on open source software, and so you can use these, but it's worthwhile figuring out what your university or your lab does care about. But also, it's sometimes relevant, as sort of came up from Mike earlier, right? What's in the code? And your sponsor, right, who's giving you money, might care whether that code is completely open source or whether somebody has to sign a license agreement on it or something. But if you get that information, don't just write your own license. Talk to your sponsor who's telling you have a restriction, or talk to your institution to figure out what you need to do. The other thing is, don't sort of make up things within the license. This might be hard to read. I can't quite tell if it's blurry. But acknowledgements should not be part of your license. Acknowledgements can be part of your relationship with your users of your code and part of the contract and sort of that community that I'll get to. But the license really just has to do with how that code is reused, how that code is used. Also, don't bury things. Don't leave a lot of ambiguity in it, right? So in the spirit of don't make things up, also don't do something like, say, go look in this README file and cite one of these 4 papers. Nobody will go to the README file and cite your paper. It has to be really straightforward. So really avoid doing that. Follow, in terms of licensing, right, what the licenses say. And then, as I said, we'll get to sort of the concept of contract later. The other thing to understand, and there's a lot of terms, right, that we use, is that free software is not necessarily open source software, and it's not necessarily a community code either. Free software is sort of different. It is a term that's used. It has, sort of just to some degree, really a definition, right, that if free software is code that you're free to take, you're free to do whatever you want with, basically. And mess around with and throw around to people, right? You can change it, distribute it, right, and do whatever you want. And that is not the same as open source, because with free software, well, I suppose you could write a license that would still allow somebody to completely do that. But with open source, you tend to have more of an agreement about how that code is being licensed. All right, on to the licensing. There's really 2 categories today for open source licensing. And I'm just talking about these sort of 2 major tracks, because as I said, there are other ways your code might get licensed, but you can even talk to us. Like, for example, I think several of us have experience with code that has to get specially licensed for different reasons. But they fall into 2 categories, the primary licenses that people consider. Permissive and copyleft are the terms used. And just in the sense that you often hear people talk about the BSD or the MIT licensing or the GPL licensing, right? That's how they're split. What does that mean? Permissive is actually it's almost self-explanatory in some respects, right? That you need to reference the license of the code that you took, but there are no restrictions after that. One way that that's relevant, this is not universally true, like this example though I gave about working with vendors, is that sometimes vendors care that it's permissive. It's easier for a vendor to work with your code and improve it if they don't have to worry sort of about cascading license requirements like you do with GPL. So with GPL, the copyleft model is that anything you do with something with a GPL license, it needs to be automatically GPL'd. That's one way to think about it, right? You can't do something else with it. You can't license it in any other way. Your code has to basically be open with the GPL source. And that's important to understand. Most of the time for science code, this really doesn't hit too often. But as I'm giving you the one example that we run into a lot, which is that the vendors prefer the left one, the permissive. If there's a holy war, I'm sure I could talk more about this. As you can imagine, with slightly different takes on what sharing source code could be, people really care sometimes about whether you're using one license versus another. And they care in that passionate way, like they care whether you use Emacs or VI. But the other thing is this, what might be useful is just to give you a sense of it, right, of how the licenses distribute between common codes that you see every day, that you're interacting with every day. Like, for example, with Python versus Linux, right? And this might be clear, right, but that license is your relationship, right, with the relationship with your users. You're sort of saying, how can you use the code that I've developed? But that is not how you develop any sort of relationship, right? You don't develop a relationship by putting a text file up there. And if you are using a code or you're developing a code either way and you're interacting with it, you're interacting with the developer, you're interacting with your users, there are more aspects of developing and cultivating your code than just necessarily putting the license on. The license is important, and it will help you. It will help you track, what's going on potentially. It will also help you with reuse, but it is not the end of the story. So we've had this astrophysics theme, and so one of the things that Sean talked about was Gadget. I'm not going to go through the story again, right? But what's important to understand that Gadget did, right, was they changed sort of how they were distributing things. They changed what they were making public and what they weren't making public. And suddenly there were sort of all of these different variants of Gadget throughout the community. And that is not the way to develop a community. That is a way to pretty quickly destroy a community, frankly. So there are best practices. This is not the only example of sort of this kind of scenarios, but best practicing is when you are the host, right? So perhaps not just the host, physical host, right? You're probably not hosting the GitHub. But when you are maybe the hub on developing a code, or when you are collaborating on developing a code. We've already talked about this. Version control is really crucial. If you have more than one developer, even if you have your own development environment, you need to have version control. And one of the benefits is that especially, not just GitHub, but there are other tools out there, right, that also help organize the social aspects of this, right? Understanding who did what and why. And there's more to it than even just tracking down the bugs, right? This has been one of the topics of sort of understanding the changes going on in the code, but it's also valuable when you're developing a community, when you want a development group. If somebody cares about the code, right, and they go see that, Nathan has made 20 check-ins in the past 2 weeks. He's clearly up to something that's sort of interesting, and it's worthwhile even starting a conversation about what he's doing at that particular point, or at least you know that Nathan's really active in developing the code. This kind of visual input, besides the value of having multiple people develop a code, also helps create and cultivate that sort of community of like, okay, it's not just anonymous person X messing up my subroutine. I know who it is, and I can go talk to them. In terms of time, I won't talk so much about social coding. It is important, and I don't want to cut it out. But we've sort of talked about a lot of these points about having groups interact and about having a code review and about having people interact about what's going on. We've also talked about continuous integration. But going back to some of these best practices, right? Those are also best practices, but some other ones we haven't spent as much time on. Consider when you're developing a code, and maybe if you want to develop a community, or you are rising within a community developing a code, the regular releases mean something. And actually one of the other, I love this best practice, is even just predictable releases, meaning that it is known that you will release the code. I'm making up a time frame every 6 months, a stable version of the code every 6 months, even if it's just with one little bug fix or something like that. The reason is it's really useful to get past that anxiety of, when will that bug get into my code? I mean, get fixed in my code. When will that happen, right? And if your users, right, and your community know that you've got this schedule, it's really valuable. And I guarantee you've probably experienced that, right? Like whether it's on your phone, right, with the bug in the OS that's quickly draining your battery, you're sitting there going, why hasn't Apple fixed it yet? And maybe they have in beta, but you don't know when they're going to move the beta out, right? It's valuable for people to understand that. Is it absolutely necessary? No. Does everybody do that? No. But it's a really nice best practice. And so this is this concept of these stable releases of this quantum of you're moving forward, and then announce, right? And all of this aspect of building a community or building a group, this is all just social, right? This is team building, this is management. It is management. It doesn't matter what you would like to call it anywhere else, it is management. And in all the good and bad things about that. So one of the most crucial things about management is communication. And so communicating out what's going on with the code, communicating out what might be problems with it, communicating out successes and papers is really fantastic. And what you might find is that as you are talking about, hey, look, we've got this new release, we had this paper, we were in a workshop, other people start, one, hearing about your code more, but also are more likely to join in and sharing that, right? And that's valuable. Again, going back to this is management. There's also a lot of PR components to this, right? About getting the visibility out. That's valuable for you, that's valuable for your code, that's valuable for careers. All right, as I said, I'm sort of skipping through a few things. We have talked about these best practices and necessary software engineering practices. And we've even talked about things like documentation being really crucial to making sure that you have decent retention, right, and that you can recruit people in. This is how you also get people to adopt your code. There are, going back to sort of the heroic programming description, there are people who will take an undocumented code and just throw themselves in it for 6 months and try to figure out what's going on. There are people who will do that. Most people don't have time. And so if somebody walks in and they see a code that's relatively well described, and as much as they might, as you can do, that has an impact that increases the rate of people coming in, that increases the rate that you might actually develop a real conversation going on about the code that's being used. You can do this even with code, right, that you are not the primary developer on. And that can be your own boon, right? There are examples of this across a variety of communities. Not necessarily where you just completely scoop the main thing of what's going on, but you are using code X, right, to do your science, and you start developing this community around what you are doing. And you don't necessarily have to wait for the leads on the code to do that by themselves, right? Chances are they might get really interested and want to join with you in doing it. But if they're not engaging in it, right, if you see benefit or if you're interested in doing that, if people are coming to you and saying, hey, I want to do what you're doing, right, that was really exciting what I saw you present, can I do it? You can actually start cultivating this on your own. Do it with respect for the fact that, you're using someone's code, right, but you can do this. All right, we did talk about yesterday how you build and you host these codes, right? So how you build and document these codes. There's a lot of different tools out there. The other component that I wanted to point out, we've alluded to it multiple times. I would guess it's been alluded to hundreds of times, perhaps over the course of the past week and a half, is that there are two sort of roles that people think of, right? That you are a developer or you're a user of the code. And it's sort of the canonical description, right? Like you've got some, cadre of people in the back room with Mountain Dew developing their code 24 hours a day, right? And you've got people externally using it, and they're using it sort of maybe in that black box model like I talked about yesterday. But frankly, that's not as common anymore. And I think it's quickly actually becoming less and less common. But there's a concept of sort of really the communities of practice, right? That you have people actually using the code, actually involved in understanding it. And that's where you have these dev users. These users are actually involved in the development. You're both doing science with it, and maybe you are just developing the components of the code that are really relevant to the science you're using. Maybe you're not touching the I/O, for example, and that's totally reasonable, but you're still involved in what the code is doing. And if I had written this slide, I'm not sure if I would put on right here for the training program that the code should not be a black box. I personally sort of believe that it should not be a black box. but it's also counter to the point I brought up yesterday, which is that there's sort of this spectrum of users. But you should understand what a code is doing. If you are going to publish science on what a code is doing, you should understand it. You should be able to speak to it. You should be able to speak to your experimental tool, and it is your experimental tool. And that's really, I think, what this slide is trying to get at. You don't necessarily have to become an expert in scientific software development, but you have to be able to speak to this. If you're closer to the black box user model, be able to still speak up, understand the physical model, understand how that physical model is in the code to some degree, right? So you can understand the limitations of it. So you can understand if somebody does stand up and publish that they found an error in the code, whether that impacts you or not, right? So that's one other way to even ask that question, right? If somebody stood up and said, we found an error in the code, it is a problem, could you relatively quickly answer whether that's relevant for what you're doing or not? If you can't, dig into the code more. From a scientific perspective, from the scientific process, dig into the code more. There's a whole other component to this, which is also how do you get communities to interact nicely? Inevitably, right, if you've got an astrophysics code that works on 2 or 3 or 4 different types of problems, chances are you also have 2 or 3 or 4 different scientists using that code, doing different science on it, and perhaps even competing for funds, right? Competing for money, competing for those papers. So it is valuable to understand that there is a conflict when you're building this community. It's not one that can't be solved, right? But there is a tension, and it has to be cultivated. You should participate in communities or create communities where at least people can disagree and disagree, heartily, right? But you can disagree heartily and not insult somebody. And so you have to treat each other, respectfully, create and cultivate that. If in the end, right, sometimes that means you have to sort of monitor and mother a list, right, so that you can actually moderate it and eliminate people who aren't playing well. Sometimes that's really necessary. And I'll tell you from experience that occasionally moderating a few things that are really terrible, people catch on pretty quickly that that's not the type of behavior that you want in whatever community it is, whatever team you're developing. Again, this is really just management, right? I mean, this is sort of extreme because people can be, I think, more vicious when you're on a mailing list, say, or on a forum than sitting in a room talking most of the time. But it is just management, right? It is team building. And there's a lot of conversations about this. What is not in this what is not in this slide deck, and we can still put this up, and I can even just add like a separate slide. There's a lot of good texts that have been written about developing code, some of them even focused on scientific software. And so there's a good list of about 6 or 7 texts that you can reference. In addition to that, there's also good texts on team building, right? And this is just generally. As scientists in varying different degrees of your career, what I will tell you is that understanding team building, understanding how to manage a group are really valuable skills. A lot of scientists don't have that, but they're really valuable. And when it comes to something as cross-disciplinary as computational science, I think it's invaluable. Because if you're able to build an effective team, chances are you can also be able to step further and build a productive interdisciplinary team. So beyond some of these other texts that I'll have a separate slide up about with, some of them are actually, they're books about how you develop code and cultivate community. There's also, you should keep an eye open, right, for what your institution offers in terms of learning some of the management skills and team building skills. Sometimes it can be hard for scientists to go sit through those, and you're like, oh my God, what are they talking through? But sometimes when you get to the other end, you actually end up with really valuable skills that would be really valuable in your future. The final thing, and this is the last slide really, is that in any community, whether it is an open source community, whether it is a community code, whether it is your research group developing your own internal code, recognizing the contributions, praising those, and promoting the contributions and the successes are really important. Don't undercut that. And don't undercut the value of recognizing someone in your team or somebody in the community who's done something that you think is really fantastic, because that often comes back and rewards you in different ways later on, and really is valuable in creating that network of support that you want in developing a complicated code. Questions?
So if you have using a tool with GPL license, it's only propagates to you if you link against it, but if you use it as an executable, you generate some results in a file and then you read on this file, does that mean that you cannot use just still the GPL license like gets propagated to you, or it's only
Meaning, like, if you're using the, if you're using the results of a GPL code, but not the actual code itself, are the results GPL'd? Is that what you mean? Is that
if
what
you
mean?
add that into your workflow, let's say you have a GPL executable,
Yeah.
that like you call it, you just call the executable with some input parameters, you get some output parameters, and then you take that some output results, you take these output results and process it with your code. Does that mean that your code is GPL
Yeah.
now? You're just calling the executable,
Yeah.
not linking.
I'll give you my first guess, and I'm happy for other input on this. My first suspicion is that no, that does not mean that your larger workflow is GPL'd. It means that you have that code within your workflow, and you should really consider how you give appropriate credit back to the group, right? You know, in terms of publications, et cetera. But you're not using the code, and the license is really about, the licenses we talked about are really about that relationship with the code. So I think you would not see that GPL propagate out. What do you think?
I honestly do not know any better.
The other way to make sure of it, right, and to make sure you don't walk into the pitfall is most people who have a GPL in their code are probably not, you know, worried about owning every last bit, right? Just ask them, right? Ask the group and make sure that they're comfortable with that. Now, they might be wrong too, but at least this goes back to this issue of communicating and developing the community with it. Ask them what their opinion is on it and move forward that way. I think it'd also be sort of a healthier issue if you run into challenges with it.
I just wanted to add a small plea. When you have software and you publish it and you have documentation with that, there's nothing more frustrating than if the examples which are given in the documentation do not work. And it is possible to also test examples in the documentation. ParaView is an example.
That's a fantastic point. And one thing I will say, we were joking a little bit about this, is that this is not an excuse about that, but it is amazing how much more effective documentation tools are today than they were 5 years ago, frankly. I mean, really, I think like certain things have just become more pervasive and more accepting. So yes, I agree emphatically. And what's fantastic is that the quality of the tools people have to make sure that these things are being tested regularly, sample tests are being tested, are much better than they were. Any other questions?
Suppose I submit a pull request. Is the license of the code that I contribute, does that automatically assume the license of the repository that I'm contributing it to?
I would assume yes. Yes. This is why, you know, I'm qualifying every one of these things, and don't judge me for it, right? But licensing does get very passionate by groups. And I haven't had my head as embedded in licenses every day that I have recently. But I would always respect the parent, right? Always respect the parent. And you can talk to them for exceptions.